137 kilometers. That's the distance between Havana and Key West, close enough to see the lights on a clear night. Close enough that in 1962, nuclear warheads stationed there had a 6-minute flight time to Washington. America faced down the Soviet Union. Khrushchev withdrew the missiles. The world exhaled. History books called it Kennedy's finest hour. But here's what nobody wrote in those history books. America spent the next 60 years celebrating a victory while turning that victory into a strategic liability, because in 2026, there's a new player on that island. And they didn't need missiles to get there. Let me show you something most people miss about geography. Cuba isn't just near America, it's a cork in the bottle. Every shipping lane between the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic passes within sight of Cuban shores. Control Cuba, and you have eyes on 40% of US maritime commerce. In 1960, America made a calculated decision. Fidel Castro's revolution couldn't be tolerated 90 miles away. The solution seemed obvious: economic strangulation. Cut them off, make them irrelevant, wait them out. The embargo wasn't just a policy, it was a philosophy. Any company trading with Cuba, sanctioned by the US, any ship docking in Havana, banned from American ports for 6 months. The message was clear and brutal: choose us or choose them. You can't have both. For 30 years, it worked, but only because someone else was footing the bill. The USSR pumped $4 to $6 billion annually into Cuba. Oil, wheat, machinery, subsidized trade, not out of communist brotherhood, out of cold, hard strategy. Cuba was Moscow's aircraft carrier in the Caribbean, an ideological foothold, a permanent reminder to Washington that the Cold War had no borders. Then, December 1991 happened. The Soviet Union collapsed. Overnight, Cuba lost 85% of its trade volume. Oil imports dropped by half. Food imports fell 80%. Soviet subsidies, the entire foundation of Cuba's economy, vanished like smoke. Cubans call it El Periodo Especial, the special period. Electricity 4 hours a day. Factories shuttered, transportation paralyzed. Oxen returned to the fields because there was no fuel for tractors. And in Washington, celebration. Finally, the thinking went. The regime will collapse. Democracy will bloom. Castro will fall. Any day now. Any day now. But Cuba didn't collapse. It adapted, slowly, painfully. It opened to limited tourism, legalized the dollar, searched desperately for trading partners, anyone, anywhere willing to ignore American threats. European companies came cautiously. Canadian firms tested the waters, but the largest economy 90 miles away remained locked shut. Here's what Washington missed while patting itself on the back. When you isolate someone for 60 years, when you make it clear they have no future with you, they don't just sit there waiting for you to change your mind, they find someone else. China didn't arrive in Cuba with fanfare. No dramatic announcements, no geopolitical manifestos. They just showed up. Early 2000s. Cuba was still reeling from the special period, still desperate, still watching the American embargo tick into its 5th decade with no end in sight. And then Chinese officials arrived with a different proposition: no lectures about democracy, no demands for free markets, no conditions about human rights or political reform, just 3 words: let's do business. The pitch was elegant: infrastructure loans, port modernization, telecommunications upgrades, energy projects, tourism investment, and here's the critical part: no political strings attached. Think about the contrast. For 60 years, America's message to Cuba was: change your government, adopt our system, meet our demands, then maybe we'll talk. China's message: we'll work with whoever's in charge. Let's build something. By 2015, Cuba owed China $6 billion. By 2020, that number held steady because the debt wasn't being called in. It was being leveraged. Let me explain what $6 billion means for an economy the size of Cuba's. Cuba's entire GDP is roughly $100 billion, so $6 billion represents 6% of total economic output. For context, if America had proportional debt to a single country, we'd owe that country $1.5 trillion. Now imagine that creditor controls your ports, your telecommunications, your power grid, your tourism industry. That's not debt, that's dependency architecture. Havana's port? Upgraded by China Harbor Engineering Company. New cranes, deepened harbors, modernized terminals capable of handling Panamax-class vessels. Why does this matter? Because ports are choke points. Whoever controls the ports controls what comes in and what goes out. And when Chinese companies build the infrastructure, Chinese naval vessels can use it. Legally, routinely, without raising eyebrows. Telecommunications? Huawei has installed 4G and 5G infrastructure across the island. Cell towers, fiber optic cables, the entire digital backbone, every phone call, every text message, every internet search, running through Chinese-built infrastructure, accessible to Beijing if they want it. Energy? Chinese companies invested in solar farms, wind projects, grid rehabilitation. Cuba's electrical system, which never fully recovered from the 1990s collapse, is being rebuilt with Chinese technology and Chinese financing. Tourism, Chinese investment has poured into resorts in Varadero, renovations in Old Havana, beach properties on the northern coast. And Chinese tourists, newly wealthy, eager to travel, have become one of Cuba's fastest growing visitor demographics. Add it together: infrastructure, Chinese built; communications, Chinese controlled; energy, Chinese funded; debt, Chinese held; tourism, Chinese dominated. This isn't partnership, this is comprehensive economic capture. And here's the genius of it: none of this required a single soldier. No military base, no treaty, no formal alliance, just patient capital, strategic investment, and the willingness to engage when everyone else walked away. If this feels familiar, it should, because Cuba isn't China's first run at this playbook. Let me show you the pattern. Venezuela. China lent Venezuela $60 billion between 2007 and 2019. In exchange, oil shipments at below market rates, long-term energy contracts that locked Venezuela into Chinese supply chains. When Venezuela's economy imploded, when US sanctions tightened, when Western banks fled, China stayed. Not out of charity, out of strategy. Today, Venezuela ships 500,000 barrels of oil to China daily. That's leverage that doesn't show up on military maps. Sri Lanka. China financed the Hambantota port, $1.5 billion for a deep water facility on the southern coast. Strategic location along major shipping lanes, tourist destination, development opportunity. Sri Lanka couldn't repay the loans, so in 2017, they handed over the port on a 99-year lease. 99 years. For practical purposes, China owns that port now, and Chinese naval vessels dock there regularly for routine resupply. Pakistan. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, $62 billion in infrastructure investment. Roads, railways, power plants, Gwadar port development. Pakistan's debt to China exceeds $25 billion. And Gwadar? It's become a key node in China's Indian Ocean presence. See the pattern? Step 1. Identify a country under economic pressure. Isolated. Desperate. Step 2. Offer loans without political conditions. Step 3. Build infrastructure that creates dependency. Step 4. Convert debt into access. Step 5. Access becomes leverage. Leverage becomes control. It's called debt trap diplomacy in the West. China calls it win-win cooperation. The terminology doesn't matter. The outcome does. And Cuba? Cuba is following the exact same trajectory. The only question is how far along the path they've already traveled, because here's where economic presence transforms into strategic capability. In 2017, China opened its first official overseas military base in Djibouti, East Africa. How did it happen? First, Chinese companies upgraded Djibouti's port. Then, Djibouti borrowed heavily from Chinese banks. Then, Chinese naval vessels began regular port calls. Then, a permanent military facility. By the time China announced the base, the infrastructure was already built. The presence was already normalized, and Djibouti's government, drowning in Chinese debt, wasn't in a position to refuse. Now apply that pattern to Cuba. The ports already being upgraded, the debt already massive, the infrastructure already in place, Chinese ships already docking regularly. The only missing piece is the official announcement. And by the time that comes, if it comes, it'll be too late to stop. Here's the scenario that keeps Pentagon strategists awake at night. China doesn't need to call it a military base. They don't need permanent troop deployments or a formal security treaty. They just need what they already have: infrastructure access, economic leverage, and a Cuban government that depends on Chinese money to survive. Imagine surveillance stations along Cuba's northern coast. Officially, weather monitoring, scientific research, telecommunications infrastructure. Unofficially, signals intelligence gathering aimed at every U.S. military installation from Key West to South Carolina. Florida's MacDill Air Force Base, 370 kilometers from Havana, Naval Station Mayport, 550 kilometers, Kings Bay Nuclear Submarine Base in Georgia, 800 kilometers, all within easy monitoring range. Imagine Chinese destroyers making routine friendship visits to Havana. Not permanent deployment, just regular port calls, refueling, resupply, rest and relaxation for crews. Monthly visits become weekly. Weekly becomes continuous. And suddenly there's a rotating Chinese naval presence 90 miles from Florida without anyone officially calling it a base. Now imagine the worst case. Chinese ballistic missile submarines, type 094 class, each carrying 12 JL-2 nuclear missiles with an 8,000-kilometer range. If one of those submarines is docked quietly, unofficially, in Cuban waters, every city in the continental United States is within range. It's 1962 all over again. Except this time, the missiles aren't Soviet property that can be negotiated away. They're Chinese assets protected by comprehensive economic entanglement. And here's the bitter irony that Chinese strategists love to point out. America has a military base in Cuba, Guantanamo Bay, maintained since 1903 despite decades of Cuban government protests demanding the US leave. America's position? The lease is permanent. We're not leaving. So imagine China using that exact logic. If America can maintain military presence on Cuban soil against the government's wishes, why can't China maintain presence with the government's permission? Think about the strategic value. Surveillance capability over the entire southeastern United States, naval access to Caribbean shipping lanes, monitoring of Gulf of Mexico oil platforms and tanker traffic, intelligence collection on U.S. military exercises, potential submarine sanctuary. For 2 centuries, American foreign policy has been built on one non-negotiable principle: no hostile military presence in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine, declared in 1823, made it explicit. The Americas are America's sphere of influence. Foreign powers stay out or face consequences. That doctrine held for 200 years, until now. Let's be clear about something. China didn't steal Cuba. America gave it away. 60 years, 12 presidents, Democrat and Republican. Every single one maintained the embargo. Every single one insisted isolation would eventually work. Any day now, they said, the regime will collapse. Any day now. 60 years later, the regime is still there. But America's influence? That collapsed instead. Here's what American policymakers missed while celebrating the 1962 victory. Nature abhors a vacuum. Economics abhors it even more. When you isolate someone for 6 decades, when you offer them nothing but demands and sanctions, when you make it clear they have no future with you, they find someone else. They have to. Survival demands it. And it's not just Cuba, Venezuela, $60 billion in Chinese debt, Ecuador, major infrastructure projects financed by Beijing, Argentina. China is the 2nd largest trading partner. Brazil, billions in Chinese agricultural and mining investment. Peru, Chinese companies dominate the mining sector. Chile, copper exports overwhelmingly flow to China. Across the entire Western Hemisphere, the pattern is identical. American policy offers the stick: sanctions, conditions, demands for political reform, lectures about democracy. Chinese policy offers the carrot: infrastructure investment, trade deals, loans without political strings, economic cooperation without regime change requirements. Which approach is winning? In 2018, Xi Jinping addressed the first China-CELAC summit in Chile. His message was simple: China will invest $250 billion in Latin America by 2025. No conditions, just business. The Monroe Doctrine isn't being defeated through military invasion. It's being made irrelevant through economic engagement. And irrelevance is worse than defeat, because defeat can be avenged. Irrelevance means the game changed, and you didn't notice until it was over. In 1962, when Soviet missiles appeared in Cuba, America could respond decisively. Naval blockade, threat of military action, crisis diplomacy with Moscow, the missiles left. In 2026, when China has comprehensive economic control over Cuban infrastructure, what's America's response? Sanction Chinese companies? That just drives Cuba closer to Beijing. Demand Cuba choose between America and China? Cuba already chose because America never offered a choice. Threaten military action over port upgrades and 5G towers? That's not defensible. This is the nightmare, not that China is in Cuba, but that there's no obvious way to get them out without either offering Cuba what it needs, which 60 years of policy makes politically impossible, or triggering exactly the kind of confrontation that 1962 barely avoided. The trap was built by American policy. China just walked through the door, Washington left open. So let's return to where we started, 90 miles from Florida, October 1962, 13 days, Kennedy's blockade, Khrushchev's withdrawal, American victory. The story we tell ourselves about that crisis is simple. American resolve defeated Soviet aggression. The threat was neutralized. Cuba would never again endanger the United States. But here's what that victory actually taught Washington, the wrong lesson. It taught American policymakers that isolation works, that economic strangulation is the answer, that if you just wait long enough, if you maintain pressure long enough, hostile regimes will eventually collapse. 60 years later, the regime hasn't collapsed, but American influence has evaporated, and now there's a new player on the island. Same strategic location, same proximity to American shores, different method, different timeline, same potential nightmare. Because here's the thing about echoes, they're never quite the same as the original sound. They're distorted, delayed, sometimes louder in unexpected places. The Cuban Missile Crisis is echoing through time, but this echo doesn't involve missiles that can be diplomatically removed. It involves infrastructure that can't be unbuilt, debt that can't be simply forgiven, economic dependency that can't be severed without Cuban economic collapse, leverage that grows stronger the longer it exists. Will Chinese ballistic missile submarines dock permanently in Havana? Probably not. Too provocative, too reminiscent of Soviet mistakes. But will Chinese surveillance stations monitor US military activities? Will Chinese naval vessels make regular port calls? Will Cuban facilities serve Chinese strategic purposes? Those aren't hypothetical questions. They're inevitable outcomes of the leverage that's already been built. The question isn't whether China will exploit the access they've purchased. The question is whether anyone in Washington will notice before the presence becomes permanent. 90 miles. In 1962, that distance nearly ended the world. In 2026, it might mark the distance of America's greatest strategic blindness, turning a Cold War victory into the foundation of a long-term defeat. Because the missiles left in 1962, but the island never stopped being strategic. And while America spent 60 years celebrating what it won, it forgot to notice what it was losing.